The courtroom felt strangely quiet that day, not the kind of silence filled with grief, but the kind filled with certainty. Certainty that the game had already been won. The judge sat in his chair, the papers were placed neatly in front of him. The lawyers were ready, and Michael Hayes, he was completely relaxed. Michael picked up the divorce papers with a faint laugh, as if this were just a formality, like clicking accept on an email. His suit was expensive, his watch polished, and on his face was that same smug confidence, the kind only people have, who believe everything is under their control. He glanced toward his wife, Emily Hayes. A simple dress, no makeup, no jewelry, her hair tied neatly back, no tears, no arguments, no pleading, just silence. To Michael, that silence was proof that he'd already won, proof that Emily was exactly what he had always believed, simple, dependent, and without value. "Your Honor," Michael said confidently, "there are no shared assets. Everything I own I earned. My wife doesn't own anything significant." A few people in the courtroom looked at each other, but Michael didn't notice. To him, these were just facts. The judge looked at Emily. "Mrs. Hayes, do you contest this?" Emily paused for a second, just 1 second, then calmly said, "No, Your Honor." A faint smile appeared on Michael's lips. Inside, he was laughing, exactly as I expected. He picked up the pen, and without the slightest hesitation, he signed the divorce papers, smiling. At that moment, Michael believed the story was over, a clean break, no drama, no loss. He had no idea, not even the slightest, that this signature was not just the end of a marriage, it was the end of his illusion. 7 years earlier, Michael believed he had made the perfect choice. Emily wasn't flashy. When she entered a room, heads didn't turn. And that's exactly what Michael liked. He was climbing fast in his career. He wanted a wife who was easy, someone who didn't demand much, someone who supported his success without asking for the spotlight. Emily fit perfectly. She spoke less. She listened more. Michael mistook her silence for simplicity, her humility for lack of ambition. On their third date, Michael talked for 2 hours straight about his plans. Emily listened the entire time. At the end, she simply said, "That sounds important to you." Michael took that as support. He never bothered to ask what was important to her. What he didn't know was that Emily was the daughter of Sinclair, Robert Sinclair, a name that never appeared in magazines, never showed up in the news, but in the world's most powerful boardrooms, it was spoken only in whispers. Emily had learned early that when money becomes visible, people change. So she chose distance. She turned privacy into protection. She became a teacher because she loved teaching. She drove an old car because it was reliable. She chose a simple life because it was safe. Michael saw all of this and misunderstood it. He assumed Emily depended on him. He assumed her comfort came from his income. He assumed that if she had anything of her own, she would have shown it. He never asked. As time passed, Michael's ego grew. Promotions, titles, recognition. Emily didn't fit into that picture. At company events, when other wives wore designer dresses, Emily looked plain. Michael began to feel that Emily made him look smaller. Then comments turned into taunts. To Michael, Emily's contribution was nothing, because it didn't appear on a spreadsheet. When the word divorce first came up, Emily asked only one question. "Are you sure?" Michael answered immediately, "Yes." The legal process moved quickly. Michael's lawyers were confident. To them it was a straightforward case. Emily didn't fight. She didn't negotiate. She simply began reading every document carefully. The wording, the finality, the irreversible clauses. Michael thought these were just formalities. He didn't realize Emily wasn't losing anything. She was waiting. As the judge reviewed the papers in the courtroom, Michael was already planning his day. Lunch, drinks, telling colleagues the story. She didn't even fight. Emily stood quietly, not nervous, not relieved, as if she were waiting for something else. The judge closed the file. Emily's lawyer stood up and said, "Your Honor, "We would like to submit one final document." For the first time, Michael's confidence wavered. Final document. The judge opened the envelope, and his expression changed, the kind of change that comes only with experience. When you realize something is not normal, the judge said slowly, "Mrs. Hayes, is it true that you are the sole beneficiary of the Sinclair Trust?" Michael laughed lightly. "A trust? So what?" The judge read the next line and said, "Estimated valuation, $1.2 trillion. The air in the courtroom froze. Michael laughed. "Nonsense." His lawyer's voice trembled. "I don't think it is." Michael looked at Emily. Emily simply said, "I chose a simple life." And in that moment, Michael realized. This case had been over for a long time. He just didn't know it. Michael Hayes didn't realize it yet, but the moment Emily said, "I chose a simple life," something irreversible had already happened inside him. The courtroom hadn't exploded. There was no shouting, no dramatic gasp. That's what made it worse. People didn't react loudly because their minds were still catching up. $1 trillion doesn't land all at once. It echoes. Michael stood there, frozen, staring at the table in front of him like the words printed on it had suddenly rearranged themselves into a foreign language. His confidence hadn't vanished in an instant. It cracked, slowly, quietly, the way glass does before it shatters. "This doesn't change anything," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. "We already signed." She agreed. Clean break. He looked toward the judge, searching for confirmation, for order, for control. But the judge wasn't looking at him anymore. He was reading, carefully, line by line. Emily's lawyer remained calm, hands folded, posture neutral. Not defensive, not aggressive, just prepared. Michael noticed that too late. He had mistaken silence for weakness again. "Mr. Hayes," the judge finally said, lifting his eyes, "these documents confirm that Mrs. Hayes is not financially dependent on you in any capacity." Michael nodded quickly. "Exactly. That's what I said." The judge continued, unbothered, "Which means the court recognizes that she entered and exited this marriage without reliance on your income." Something about that phrasing unsettled him. Entered and exited. As if Emily had been walking through a door he never even saw. Emily stood there quietly. Her face hadn't changed. No triumph, no satisfaction, just composure, the kind that comes from clarity, not victory. Michael turned toward her again, voice lowering, trying to regain ground. "You could have told me," he said. "You let me look like an idiot." Emily met his gaze. "You never asked," she replied. That sentence landed harder this time, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. Michael opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He ran through the past 7 years in his head, searching for a moment where he had asked anything real about her inner world, about her background, about her choices. There was nothing. He had spoken, assumed, concluded. The judge cleared his throat. "This court finds no grounds to reopen the agreement," he said. "The divorce will proceed as submitted." Michael felt a sudden pressure in his chest. "No, wait," he said quickly. "I didn't have this information. This changes everything." The judge looked at him evenly. "It changes your understanding," he said, "not the facts." The gavel came down, not loud, not dramatic, final. Emily turned slightly, preparing to leave. The motion was small, but Michael felt it like a door slamming shut. "Emily," he said, standing abruptly. "Wait, we need to talk." She paused, just long enough to remind him of all the times she had paused while listening to him. "We already did," she said softly. "For 7 years. You just never listened." And then she walked away. No speech, no explanation, no look back. Michael stood there, alone in the middle of the courtroom, surrounded by people who had already moved on to the next case. Chairs shifted, papers shuffled. Lives continued. His attorney touched his arm. "Michael," he said quietly. "We should go." Michael nodded, numb. As he walked out, he felt eyes on him. Not admiring, not respectful, curious. No. The kind of looks people give when a story has flipped and everyone realizes it at the same time. In the hallway, the light felt too bright, the air too loud. Michael loosened his tie, breathing shallowly. "This isn't fair," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the words didn't convince him anymore. Over the next few days, the story spread, not as a headline at first, as whispers. A colleague asked if he was okay. Another joked awkwardly. Someone forwarded an article about high-profile divorces that didn't mention names but didn't need to. Michael started to notice the shift. Meetings felt different. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. A senior partner pulled him aside. "We're getting attention," he said carefully. "Nothing official. Just awareness." Awareness. Michael knew what that meant. He was no longer the man in control of the narrative. He was the man who had confidently signed away a marriage while laughing, only to discover he had never understood it in the first place. At night, alone in his apartment, Michael replayed moments he had dismissed for years. Emily sitting quietly at dinners. Emily listening while he talked about himself. Emily suggesting slower mornings, fewer late nights. He had called it lack of ambition. Now it felt like restraint. He remembered the words he had used in court. "She doesn't own anything of value." The memory made his stomach turn, not because it was wrong on paper, but because of what it revealed about him. He had defined value so narrowly that he could look at a human being, his wife, and reduce her to a balance sheet. Emily had never asked for credit. She had never demanded recognition. She had carried weight he never saw because it wasn't loud. Michael poured himself a drink one evening, staring at old photos on his phone. Vacations, dinners, Emily smiling quietly in the background of his life. He felt something unfamiliar settle in, not anger, not jealousy, regret, not for money he never had access to, but for the chance to know someone he'd underestimated, for mistaking confidence for depth, for believing control was the same as power. He tried to text her once, typed, deleted, typed again. Nothing sounded right. Everything felt too late, so he didn't send anything. Emily, meanwhile, returned to the life she had always chosen. Quiet mornings, purposeful work, private routines. Her wealth remained where it always had. Managed, distant, unobtrusive. It didn't rush in to fill a void because there wasn't one. She made one small change. She started a scholarship fund at her school. Quietly. No press, no name on a plaque. It paid for books, lunches, after-school programs. Michael would never know. That was the point. Months passed. Michael's career recovered in small ways, less swagger, more caution. People said he had matured. They didn't know the truth. He had been dismantled by a moment he could never undo. The courtroom hadn't exposed Emily's secret. It had exposed his character, and that realization followed him everywhere. Heavier than any number, louder than any headline, impossible to escape. What haunted Michael the most wasn't the number. People assumed it was. They always did. $1 trillion sounded obscene, unreal, almost fictional. That's what everyone latched onto when they retold the story. The shock value, the irony, the punchline. But that wasn't what kept Michael awake at night. What haunted him was the moment before the reveal, the confidence, the laughter, the certainty, the way he had leaned back in his chair, convinced he was above the situation, the way he had spoken about Emily instead of to her, the ease with which he had reduced 7 years of marriage to a single sentence. "She doesn't own anything of value." That sentence echoed now, not because it was challenged by money, but because it exposed how he defined value in the first place. Michael began noticing things he had never noticed before. At work, he watched how people spoke in meetings, who interrupted, who listened, who waited. For the first time, he saw how often the loudest voice wasn't the most competent, just the most desperate to be seen. He started hearing Emily's voice in his head, not her words, her presence, the calm, the patience, the lack of urgency to prove anything. It unsettled him, because everything he had built his life on depended on proving something. Constantly. Visibility had been his Currency. Recognition, his oxygen. Emily had lived without either, and somehow she had been fine. He remembered something small, something insignificant at the time. Years ago, during a dinner with colleagues, one of Michael's friends had joked about old money types being boring, irrelevant, living off the past. Michael had laughed along. Emily hadn't. She had smiled politely, excused herself, and gone to the kitchen to refill drinks. Michael remembered rolling his eyes. So sensitive, he had thought. Now he wondered if she had simply recognized something he didn't, that power rarely announces itself, and those who mock what they don't understand often do so because they're threatened by it. The story followed Michael whether he wanted it to or not. Not loudly, quietly, in the way conversations paused, in the way people asked questions that weren't really questions, in the way compliments felt more cautious now. He wasn't ruined, but he was reclassified, and for someone who had built his identity on perception, that was devastating. Emily never commented publicly. That silence confused people. Why not defend herself? Why not explain? Why not tell her side? But Emily understood something Michael never had. Explanation invites judgment. Silence denies it. She didn't need the world to understand her. She only needed the truth to exist where it mattered. The courtroom, the record, her freedom. One afternoon, weeks later, Michael sat alone in a cafe he used to frequent often. It was the kind of place where people came to be seen working, laptops open, conversations performative. He noticed a woman at a nearby table. She was quiet, dressed simply, reading instead of scrolling. No one paid attention to her. Michael couldn't stop watching. For the first time, he wondered how many Emilys he had overlooked in his life, how many people he had dismissed because they didn't perform power in a way he recognized. The thought made him uncomfortable. Good. Emily, on the other hand, felt lighter, not relieved, unburdened. She hadn't won anything. She hadn't taken anything. She had simply removed herself from a situation that required her to shrink in order to survive. Her father asked her once, gently, "Any regrets?" Emily thought for a moment. "No," she said. "Just clarity." Robert Sinclair nodded. "That's expensive," he said. "Most people never get it." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone who looked closely. Michael had spent his life chasing power and lost control in a courtroom. Emily had spent her life avoiding power and walked out untouched. She didn't rise. He fell. That difference mattered. Michael tried to rationalize it one last time. He told himself she should have told him, that transparency was fairness, that marriage implied disclosure, but deep down he knew that fairness assumes mutual respect, and respect was something he had never fully given her. He had never been curious about her woe. Arnold. Never asked without assuming. Never listened without preparing his response. The courtroom didn't change that. It revealed it. What lingered wasn't shame. It was awareness that the hierarchy he believed in was imaginary. That confidence without curiosity is blindness. That silence isn't empty, it's selective. Michael hadn't lost because Emily was wealthy. He lost because he laughed at what he didn't understand. Emily continued teaching, correcting papers, guiding students, living quietly. Her life didn't expand outward, it deepened inward. That was the difference. Michael began speaking less, listening more. He didn't suddenly become wise, but he became aware of how far he had been from it. And that awareness was heavy, but necessary. The story people told would always focus on the twist, the billionaire wife, the laughing husband, the signature. But the real story was simpler and more uncomfortable. A man mistook visibility for value. A woman chose silence over performance, and reality corrected the assumption, not loudly, not cruelly, precisely. With time, the noise around Michael faded. That's how these stories always go. At first, everyone talks, they dissect, they laugh, they judge. Then something newer comes along and attention moves on. But when the noise disappeared, something worse replaced it. Silence. Not Emily's silence. That kind had always been controlled. This was the silence that follows exposure, the kind that leaves you alone with yourself. Michael discovered that without an audience, his confidence had nowhere to live. He started noticing how much of his identity had been built for reaction. The way he spoke in meetings, sharp, certain, performative. The way he dressed, not for comfort but for signaling. The way he framed his success, always outward, always comparative. He had never asked himself a simple question. Who am I when no one is impressed? The answer disturbed him. Michael began therapy, though he didn't tell anyone that part. At first he talked about Emily, about betrayal, about humiliation. But the therapist kept circling back to the same thing. You keep saying she hid something from you, she said. But what did you assume instead? That question lingered. Michael had assumed superiority. He had assumed leadership. He had assumed entitlement. He had assumed he was the measure. And because the world had rewarded him for years, no one had ever forced him to question it. Until Emily. He remembered a moment from years earlier. Emily had once said quietly, "You don't have to win every conversation." Michael had laughed. "I do if I'm right," he had replied. Now he understood how little that had to do with truth, and how much it had to do with control. Meanwhile, Emily's life became a case study in contrast. People expected her to change everything, upgrade her life, signal her status. She didn't. She kept her routines, her work, her pace. The only noticeable shift was internal. Emily no longer filtered herself to be palatable, not louder, not harsher, just clearer. She stopped over-explaining, stopped softening truths, stopped absorbing responsibility that wasn't hers. It wasn't a transformation, it was a release. Michael ran into someone who knew Emily once, months later, a mutual acquaintance, casual, well-meaning. She was always so calm, the person said. I guess now we know why. Michael felt something tighten. No, he said before he could stop himself. That's not why. The person looked surprised. Michael didn't explain further. He finally understood something most people never do. Money hadn't made Emily calm. It had simply given her the option to be. She had chosen that long before him. The more Michael reflected, the more he realized how often he had confused dominance with strength. He had believed that being unchallenged meant being right, that being followed meant being respected, that being loud meant being powerful. Emily had lived outside that framework entirely. She didn't seek agreement. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't correct misconceptions unless accuracy mattered. That kind of power doesn't sparkle. It settles. Michael noticed a pattern. Every time he had mocked Emily, directly or indirectly, it had been when she didn't respond. Her silence had irritated him because it denied him feedback. No resistance, no validation, no opposition, just space. And space, he now realized, is dangerous when you're unsure of yourself. Emily's father said something to her one evening as they walked together. People will try to rewrite this story, he said. They'll say you embarrassed him, that you tricked him. Emily nodded. I know. And? He asked. They need that version, she replied. It protects them from seeing themselves in him. Robert smiled faintly. You learned early, he said. That's rare. Michael eventually stopped trying to defend himself. Not because he was noble, because he was tired. Every explanation sounded like justification. Every justification sounded like avoidance. And deep down he knew the truth didn't need his participation anymore. It existed without him. That was the hardest part. The lesson settled in slowly, painfully. Michael hadn't been punished by Emily. He had been corrected by reality, and reality doesn't argue. It just is. Emily never reached out again. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Some doors don't close loudly. They close because you walk through them and never look back. Michael finally understood that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you earn by understanding what actually happened. And what had happened wasn't a betrayal, it was exposure. Not of Emily's wealth, but of Michael's assumptions. He began noticing how often people underestimate quietness. How often silence is mistaken for submission. How often simplicity is read as lack. And he wondered, too late, how many times he had laughed at power simply because it didn't announce itself. Emily's strength had never been hidden. It had been unperformed. That was the difference. By the time Michael fully understood what had happened, the moment had long passed. That's the cruel part about clarity. It never arrives when it's useful, only when it's unavoidable. Michael used to believe that lessons came with instructions, with warnings, with second chances. He was wrong. Some lessons arrive only after the damage is done, not to save you, but to change you. The hardest truth Michael had to face wasn't about Emily. It was about himself. He realized that throughout his life, he had relied on a single dangerous shortcut. If something doesn't look powerful, it probably isn't. That belief had served him well in competitive environments, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where confidence often substitutes for competence. But it failed him in the one place where it mattered most: human connection. Michael started paying attention to patterns he had ignored before: who spoke first in meetings, who spoke last, who waited to be invited, who didn't need to be. He noticed that the people who rushed to assert themselves were often the most insecure, and the people who waited, who observed, were usually the ones making decisions later. Emily had always been in that second group. He had mistaken her patience for passivity. One night, Michael reread the divorce agreement. Not for legal reasons, for psychological ones. He saw it clearly now. Emily hadn't negotiated because she didn't need to. She hadn't argued because she wasn't threatened. She hadn't defended herself because her worth didn't depend on his recognition. She had walked into that courtroom already whole. Michael hadn't. Emily's strength unsettled people because it didn't fit the familiar script. She didn't win in a way that looked like victory. She didn't lose in a way that looked like defeat. She simply exited, and that exit did more damage to Michael's identity than any confrontation ever could. Michael remembered a phrase Emily once used casually years ago. "I don't like noise," she had said. "It confuses things that are already clear." At the time, Michael had laughed. Now he understood. Noise had been his shield, volume his armor. Without it, he felt exposed. Emily, meanwhile, had moved further into alignment with herself. She wasn't healing. She wasn't rebuilding. She had never broken. The end of the marriage didn't require recovery. It required release. She gave herself permission to stop shrinking, not by expanding outward, but by removing friction, no longer explaining herself, no longer accommodating assumptions, no longer managing someone else's ego. That was freedom. People often asked quietly why Emily never revealed the truth earlier. Was it fair? Was it honest? Emily's answer, when she gave one at all, was simple. "I wasn't hiding. T wasn't performing." That distinction mattered. She had never lied. She had never misled. She had simply refused to turn her identity into a credential. Michael finally grasped the real imbalance between them. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was awareness. Emily had always known who she was, independent of context. Michael had defined himself by context alone. Take away the applause, the titles, the perceived advantage, and he felt hollow. Emily felt unchanged. The story lingered not because of shock value, but because it forced people to confront something uncomfortable. That we are often wrong about who holds power. That our instincts favor noise over substance. That we reward performance more than presence. Michael had been the embodiment of that bias. Emily had been its contradiction. Over time, Michael stopped telling the story at all, not because it stopped hurting, but because he stopped needing to control how it sounded. That, too, was growth. He learned to ask questions without assuming answers, to listen without planning a response, to notice what didn't demand attention. He was quieter now, not humble, aware. Emily never returned to the courtroom in memory. She didn't need to. That chapter had ended the moment she walked out without looking back. The rest of her life unfolded without commentary. That was intentional. The greatest misconception people had about Emily was that she had won. She hadn't. Winning implies competition. Illy had opted out. And that choice, that refusal to play a game built on assumptions, was what made her untouchable. Michael learned something most people never do. That power doesn't always fight. It doesn't always correct. It doesn't always reveal itself. Sometimes it waits, and sometimes it walks away. The courtroom hadn't been a battlefield. It had been a mirror. And Michael had laughed at his reflection, until reality showed him what he was actually looking at. Emily understood this from the beginning, that silence, when chosen, not imposed, is not weakness. It's leverage, and the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who doesn't need you to believe in them. Time did something strange after the divorce. It didn't heal Michael, it revealed him. Without the urgency to perform, without the constant chase for validation, Michael was forced to sit with parts of himself he had ignored for years. There was no crisis anymore, no scandal, just the quiet aftermath of realization. And that quiet was louder than any courtroom. Michael began to understand something uncomfortable. He had never actually known Emily. He had known a version of her, the one that fit neatly into his narrative, the supportive wife, the quiet presence, the background character. But that version had been incomplete by design, not because Emily hid herself, but because Michael never looked beyond what confirmed his assumptions. He remembered how often he had filled silence. If Emily didn't respond immediately, he spoke. If she paused, he concluded. If she stayed quiet, he decided what that quiet meant. Silence to him had always been a vacuum, something to dominate. To Emily, it had been a boundary. Michael noticed the difference everywhere now. In meetings, he saw who rushed to speak and who waited. In conversations, he noticed who needed agreement and who didn't. In relationships, he sensed who required validation to feel real. He had been the first kind. Emily had always been the second. One afternoon, Michael attended a small networking event. Nothing flashy, just professionals exchanging stories. Someone mentioned power casually. Michael listened. Everyone had a different definition: influence, money, reach, control. Michael realized his definition had been the most fragile of all. He had believed power was something you proved. Emily had lived like it was something you protected. Emily's silence after the divorce became part of her identity in people's minds. Some admired it, some misread it, but Emily didn't correct them, because silence, when chosen, doesn't need clarification. She understood that people reveal more through their interpretations than through their questions. If someone thought her quiet meant mystery, fine. If someone thought it meant arrogance, also fine. Neither required her participation. Michael tried once more to reach out. Not with an apology, not with an explanation, just a simple mess. Age, I hope you're well. He stared at it for a long time. Then he deleted it, not because he didn't mean it, but because he finally understood something essential. Well wishes can still be intrusions when they serve the sender more than the receiver. Emily, meanwhile, had begun mentoring younger teachers, not formally, not publicly. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that made people think, offered guidance without authority. Those who worked with her noticed something subtle. Emily never rushed. Not decisions, not conclusions, not people. She trusted timing. Her father once asked her if she ever felt tempted to explain herself, to correct the narrative. Emily smiled. Only when it would benefit someone else more than me, she said. That was rare. Michael's life didn't fall apart. That's what made the lesson so sharp. He still had work, still had status, still had comfort. But something fundamental had shifted. He no longer mistook attention for respect. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. The memory of the courtroom changed shape over time. At first, it felt like humiliation. Later, it felt like exposure. Eventually, it became instruction. Michael realized the moment he lost wasn't when Emily's wealth was revealed. It was when he laughed. That laugh had been certainty without curiosity, and that combination is always dangerous. Emily's story wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about self-definition. She had defined herself internally. Michael had defined himself externally. When external markers shift, one collapses, the other remains. Michael began practicing restraint, not as a performance, as discipline. He learned to pause before reacting, to ask instead of assume, to listen without waiting to speak. It didn't make him powerful. It made him accurate. Emily never checked to see how Michael was doing. Not out of cruelty, out of respect for boundaries she had learned to enforce. Closure doesn't require conversation when clarity already exists. The story, when retold years later, lost its shock value. People stopped mentioning the number. What remained was the lesson, that silence can be intentional, that simplicity can be strategic, that power doesn't need an introduction. Michael understood now why Emily had never corrected him, because correction invites debate, and debate assumes equality of perspective. Emily hadn't debated because she wasn't confused. The most unsettling realization Michael came to was this: Emily had trusted him, not with money, not with secrets, with her normalcy. She had trusted that he would value her without credentials. And when he didn't, she withdrew, quietly, cleanly. That withdrawal wasn't punishment, it was alignment. Emily's life continued, unchanged in appearance, transformed in essence. Michael's life continued too, but with a scar he would always carry, not visible, not discussable, but permanent. The lesson wasn't that silence hides power, it was that power chooses when to speak, and when it doesn't, it's not because it can't, it's because it doesn't need to. Years later, when people brought up the story, they told it wrong. They always did. They framed it like a twist, a punchline, a moment of shock. The man who laughed in court, the wife who turned out to be a billionaire. It made the story entertaining. It made it safe, because if the lesson stayed at the level of irony, no one had to look inward. But Michael knew better. The real break in the narrative hadn't happened when the judge read the number. It happened when his assumptions collapsed. Michael learned that stories don't control us, beliefs do. And his belief had been simple and dangerous. If I don't see it, it doesn't exist. That belief had shaped his marriage, his career, his identity. Emily had existed outside of it the entire time. One evening, Michael was invited to speak at a small leadership roundtable. Nothing high profile, no cameras, just discussion. Someone asked a familiar question. What do you think real power looks like? Michael paused. Old Michael would have answered instantly, with certainty, with polish. This time he waited. I think, he said slowly, real power is being able to walk away without explaining yourself. The room went quiet, not because it was impressive, but because it was true. Emily had never needed to dominate a room. She had never needed to win arguments. She had never needed to correct Michael's version of her, because her life wasn't built on his perception. Michael's had been. He thought back to the day she walked out of the courtroom. No drama, no tears, just alignment. That was the moment the narrative truly broke, because stories usually end with confrontation. This one ended with absence, and absence, Michael learned, is terrifying when you depended on someone to reflect your importance back to you. Emily's students adored her, not because she was charismatic, but because she was present. She remembered details, noticed patterns, listened without rushing. Parents trusted her, colleagues respected her. None of them knew, or needed to know, anything about the Sinclair Trust. Her authority came from consistency. That kind of power doesn't require credentials. Michael began noticing how often people confuse revelation with reversal. They think something changes because new information appears. But the truth is simpler. Nothing about Emily had changed in that courtroom. What changed was visibility, and visibility had never been the source of her strength. Michael stopped attending events where stories were traded like currency. He had no appetite for spectacle anymore. Instead, he spent time with people who asked better questions, people who listened, people who didn't rush to define others. He found peace there, not happiness. Peace. Emily never corrected the record. She didn't need to. People who mattered understood. People who didn't never would. That was another lesson Michael learned too late. Explanation is not a bridge, it's an invitation, and not everyone deserves access. When Michael finally allowed himself to grieve, it wasn't for the marriage, it was for the version of himself he had believed in. The confident man, the provider, the one in control. That man had existed only because no one had challenged him. Emily hadn't challenged him either. She had simply stepped out of the role that sustained him. And without that reflection, the illusion faded. Emily's father once said something quietly to her during a walk. "People will learn from this," he said. Emily shook her head. "Some will," she replied. "Most will just be entertained." He smiled. "That's always been the ratio." Michael understood now why Emily's silence felt heavier than any argument. But arguments keep you engaged. Silence releases you, and release feels like abandonment to someone who confuses attention with worth. The story continued to circulate, but its meaning diluted with every retelling, until one day it became just another anecdote. Michael let it go, not because it stopped mattering, but because it no longer defined him. Emily never thought of it as a story, but to her it was simply a boundary enforced, a decision honored, a life recalibrated. Michael finally articulated the truth he had avoided for years. Emily didn't embarrass him, she outgrew him, in status, in awareness, And awareness, unlike money or reputation, cannot be taken, it can only be earned, often painfully, often late. The final irony wasn't that Michael laughed in court, it was that he laughed because he thought he understood everything. And the moment he realized he didn't, the laughter disappeared forever. Somewhere, Emily stood on a quiet balcony one evening, watching the city lights, not reflecting, not remembering, just living. She had never needed the narrative to break, she had simply stepped outside of it. In the end, the story didn't belong to the courtroom, That's what most people get wrong. They think the courtroom was the climax, the reveal, the twist, But the courtroom was just the mirror. The real story had been unfolding quietly for years, long before any judge. Any papers, any signatures. Michael Hayes didn't lose his marriage because Emily was wealthy. He lost it because he never learned how to see her. He mistook calm for compliance, silence for absence, simplicity for lack. And by the time reality corrected him, it was already too late. Emily never wanted to win. Winning requires an opponent. She didn't see Michael as one. She simply reached a point where staying required her to become smaller, and leaving allowed her to remain whole. That choice didn't come from money. It came from self-respect. People love dramatic endings. They want shouting, revenge, public humiliation. But the most powerful endings are often quiet. No announcement, no explanation, no apology demanded. Just distance. Emily walked away without trying to teach Michael a lesson. Yet the lesson followed him everywhere. The irony that stayed with Michael for the rest of his life wasn't that his wife was a billionaire. It was that she had lived beside him every day without ever needing to prove anything. And he never noticed. Years later, if someone asked Michael what changed him, he didn't talk about divorce. He didn't mention money. He said one thing: "I learned that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming silence means weakness. Because silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's control." Emily never returned to that chapter. She didn't rewrite it, didn't revisit it, didn't romanticize it. She understood something deeply freeing. You don't need closure from people who never truly saw you. You just need alignment with yourself. The world kept moving. New stories replaced old ones, new scandals, new headlines. Michael became a footnote. Emily became invisible again. And that invisibility was her power. The real warning hidden inside this story was never about money. It was about perception, about how easily we dismiss people who don't perform strength in familiar ways, about how often arrogance hides behind confidence, about how certainty without curiosity eventually collapses. Michael laughed when he signed those papers because he believed the story was finished. But the truth is, that was the moment the story finally began, just not the one he thought he was writing. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: The most powerful people in the room are rarely the loudest, rarely the flashiest, rarely the ones demanding attention. They're the ones who don't need it. They wait, they observe, and when the moment comes, they leave,